Contrary to what a lot of people mistakenly believe, poverty and inequality are not the same thing. Simply put, poverty describes a situation where a person doesn't have enough money to meet his basic needs, with the two main poverty types being 1. Absolute poverty, where we set a certain income level and say that those who earn less are considered poor no matter where they live. The World Bank has such a poverty limit, which was last updated back in October of 2015 and currently lies at $1.90 per day. 2. Relative poverty, which is location dependent and basically describes a state of not being able to afford your basic needs when it comes to your location. For example, someone earning $5 per day might afford the basics, including a place to live in many African countries, but not in Germany. So the relative poverty threshold is higher in Germany. In contrast, economic inequality refers to income, wealth, or anything else that is distributed unevenly. As an ultra-simplified example, we'll assume country A has 100,000 citizens, with 50,000 earning $1 per day and the other 50,000 earning $2 daily. In other words, 50% of country A's citizens live below the World Bank's poverty limit. What if next year something positive happens and the $1 per day citizens earn $2, whereas the $2 per day ones earn $10? As strange as it may seem, the two indicators tell the story in different ways because 1. Poverty has been completely eliminated now that everyone earns $2 daily or more, but 2. The income of half the citizens doubled, whereas for the other half, it's now 5 times higher. Therefore, there's currently more inequality than before, despite everyone making more money. Simple enough?
Good day, everyone. I am Alana Tidilatore, together with my partner Edward Jobdasa, and we will be discussing the Chapter 5 entitled Poverty, Inequality, and Development. For the contents of our report, first is the measuring inequality. Next, measuring absolute poverty, poverty, inequality, and social welfare, absolute poverty, extent and magnitude, economic characteristic of high poverty groups, policy measures on income inequality and poverty, some basic considerations. To begin with our discussion, let us first define what is poverty. So, poverty is a pronounced deprivation in well-being. In narrow definitions of well-being are typically linked to commodities. In other words, whether households or individuals have enough resources to meet their needs. So in this case, poverty is seen largely in monetary and in terms in relation to households' income or consumption. On the other hand, inequality refers to disparities and discrepancies in areas such as income, wealth, education, health, nutrition, space, politics, and social identity. For the first topic, measuring inequality, these are the measurements or tools or ways on how to measure inequality. There are two principal measures of income distribution for both analytical and quantitative purposes. The first one is the personal or the size distributions of income. The next one is the distributive factor or the functional distributions of income. Personal or size distribution of income is the most commonly used by economists. It simply deals with individual persons or households and the total income they receive. Personal distribution of income is the distribution of income according to size class of persons. For example, the share of total income accruing to the poorest is specific percentage or the richest is specific percentage of the population, without regard to the sources of that income. Economists and statisticians therefore like to arrange all individuals by ascending personal incomes. Ascending means it ranges from the lowest up to the highest personal income, and then divide the total population into distinct groups or sizes. Like for example, here in table 5.1, the typical size distribution of personal income in a developing country by income shares, quintiles and deciles. Here in first column, you can see that there are 20 individuals representing the, the whole population. And for the second column is the personal income, ranging from the lowest personal income up to the highest one. So for the third column naman is the quintiles. Quintiles is a 20% proportion of any numerical quantity. A population divided into quintiles would be divided into 5 groups of equal size. So there are 20 individuals divided by 5 is equal to 4. That's why the first quintiles is here in the fourth individuals. So um, the total or national income of all individuals amounts to 100 units and is the sum of all entries. This here in column 2. The first quintile represents the bottom 20% of the population in the income scale. This group receives only 5%. So if you add 0.8, 1, and 1.4 and 1.8 is equal to 5. The bottom 20% of the population only receives 5% of the national income, or a total of 5 money units. Alternatively, the bottom 40% of the population receives a total of 14%. 5 plus 9 is equal to 14. So, the first and second quantiles is the 40%, or the bottom 40% of the entire population, and it only received a total of 14%, while the top 20% of the total population receives 51, or the 51% of the total national income. A common measure of income inequality that can be derived from column 3 is the ratio of the incomes received by the top 20% and the bottom 40% of the population. In this case, the bottom 40% of the entire population will only total to 14%, while the top 20% of the total population receive 51%. So to provide a more detailed breakdown of the size distribution of income, the decile, or a 10% portion of any numerical quantity, a population divided into deciles would be divided into 10 equal numerical groups. So the first two poorest individuals only receive the 1.8 of the total national income, while the top 10%, or the top two richest individuals receives 28.5%. Next is the Kuznets ratio. It is one of the simplest indicators of income distribution. It can be computed by dividing the income of top 20% over the income of bottom 40%. In this case, the income of top 20% is equal to 51, and the income of bottom 40% is equal to 14. So 51 divided by 14 is equal to 3.64. So another common way to analyze personal income statistics is to construct what is known as a Lorenz curve. Lorenz curve is a graph depicting the variance of the size distribution of income from perfect equality. It plots percentage of income as a function of the cumulative percentage of income recipients. It is important to remember that in Lorenz curve, we use a cumulative percentage of income recipients and not the absolute terms. So the Lorenz curve shows the actual quantitative relationship between the percentage of income recipients and the percentage of the total income they did in fact receive during, say, a green year.
Rents curve. This curve shows the spread of household incomes plotted on a chart. Households are first organized according to their respective household incomes, from the lowest to the highest. A line is drawn through the points where the cumulative proportion of households is plotted against the corresponding cumulative proportion of income. This is the Lorenz curve. If every household has the same income, the Lorenz curve lies along the 45-degree line. This is known as the perfect equality line, where the household incomes of all households are equally distributed. However, if one household has all the income and others have zero income, the Lorenz curve is flat at the horizontal axis before it rises to 100%, where all the income is earned by one household. This is known as the perfect inequality line.
A final and very convenient shorthand summary measure of the relative degree of income inequality in a country can be obtained by calculating the ratio of the area between the diagonal and the Lorenz curve divided by the total area of the half square in which the curve lies, and it is called the Gini coefficients. Gini coefficients and aggregate measures of inequality is an aggregate numerical measure of income inequality ranging from 0, the perfect equality, to 1, the perfect inequality. It is measured graphically by dividing the area between the perfect equality line and the Lorenz curve, with the total area lying to the right of the equality line in the Lorenz diagram. It is said that the higher the value of the coefficient is, the higher the inequality of income distribution. So meaning, the lower it is, the more equal the distribution of income.
What is Gini coefficient? Household incomes vary from one household to another. The Gini coefficient measures the spread of household incomes across all households. How do we calculate the Gini coefficient using the Lorenz curve? Let us call the area between the perfect equality line and the Lorenz curve as area A, and the area under the Lorenz curve as area B. The Gini coefficient is calculated by taking area A divided by the sum of areas A and B. The Gini coefficient varies between the values of 0 and 1. The Gini coefficient is 0 when the Lorenz curve coincides with the perfect equality line, which reflects perfect equality. As the Lorenz curve moves further away from the perfect equality line, the Gini coefficient increases, reflecting greater uneven spread of household incomes and subsequently greater income inequality. The Gini coefficient is 1 when the Lorenz curve coincides with the perfect inequality line, which reflects perfect inequality. The Gini coefficient is used as a measure of income inequality by countries around the world.
As it turns out, the Gini coefficient is among a class of measures that satisfy 4 highly desirable properties. So what are these 4 highly desirable properties for inequality measures? These desirable properties are the anonymity, scale independence, population independence, and the transfer principle. Let's first discuss anonymity. The anonymity principle simply means that our measure of inequality should not depend on who has the higher income. So next is the scale independence. Scale independence principle means that our measure of inequality should not depend on the size of the economy or the way we measure its income. Example of this is our inequality measure should not depend on whether we measure income in dollars or in cents, or for that matter on whether the economy is rich on average or poor on average. Because if we are interested in inequality, we want a measure of the dispersion of income, not its magnitude. Next desirable property is the population independence principle. It states that a measure of inequality should not be based on the number of income recipients. Last property is the transfer principle that states that all other incomes are constant. If we transfer some income from a rich person to a poorer person, but not so much that the poorer person is now richer than the originally rich person. The resulting new income distribution is more equal. Gini coefficients satisfy all four properties, so does the coefficient of variation and some others. Functional distributions is the second common measure of income distribution used by economists that attempts to explain the share of total national income that each of the factors of production. Factors of production are the resources or inputs required to produce a good or service, such as land, labor, and capital. Instead of looking at individuals as separate entities, the theory of functional income distribution inquires into the percentage that labor receives as a whole and compare this with the percentage of total income distributed in the form of rent, interest, and profit. In other words, the returns to land and financial and physical capital. Although specific individuals may receive income from all these sources, that is not a matter of concern for the functional approach. So, measuring absolute poverty. Let's first define what is absolute poverty. Absolute poverty is the situation of being unable or only barely able to meet the subsistence essentials of food, clothing, and shelter. Like with the inequality measures, we also have desirable properties for poverty measures. As you can see, in the first two principles is the same with what I've discussed in the inequality measures. Let's move on to monotonicity principle. Means that if you add income to someone below the poverty line, all other incomes held constant. Poverty can be no greater than it was. Next is the distributional sensitivity. It states that other things being equal. So if you transfer income from a poor person to a richer person, the resulting economy should be deemed strictly poorer. Absolute poverty is sometimes measured by the number or headcount of those whose incomes fall below the absolute poverty line. Headcount index is a proportion of a country's population living below the poverty line. To compute the headcount index, we will be dividing the number of persons who are poor and the total number of people in the economy. The headcount ratio satisfies anonymity, population independence, and monotonicity, but it fails on distributional sensitivity. The simple headcount fails even to satisfy the population independence principle. Economists attempt to calculate a total poverty gap, or the TPG. The total poverty gap is the sum of the difference between the poverty line and actual income levels of all people living below that line. TPG measures the total amount of income necessary to raise everyone who is below the poverty line up to that line. The extent to which the incomes of the poor lie below the poverty line is found by adding up the amounts by which each person's income. We can think of the TPG in a simplified way as the amount of money per day it would take to bring every poor person in an economy up to our defined minimum income standards. On a per capita basis, we have average poverty gap or APG. So APG is equal to TPG divided by N, where TPG is the total poverty gap, where N is the number of persons in the economy. Often, we are interested in the size of the average poverty gap in relation to the poverty line. So, we would use as our income shortfall measure the normalized poverty gap. The normalized poverty gap is equal to APG divided by YP. Another important poverty gap measure is the average income shortfall or the AIS. AIS is equal to TPG divided by age, where age is the number of poor persons and TPG is the total poverty gap. The AIS tells us the average amount by which the income of a poor person falls below the poverty line. This measure can also be divided by the poverty line to yield a fractional measure, the normalized income shortfall, where NIS is equal to AIS divided by YP. The Foster-Greer-Torbeck Index is a class of measures of the level of absolute poverty. It is a well-known poverty index that in certain forms satisfies all four criteria. The Foster-Greer-Torbeck Index is given by this formula where N is equal to the population, H is the number of poor persons, YI is the income of I poor person, YP is the poverty line. Depending on the value of alpha, the Foster-Greer-Torbeck Index takes on different forms. If alpha is equal to 0, the numerator is equal to h, and we get the headcount ratio, which is the h divided by n. If alpha is equal to a, we get the normalized per capita poverty gap. And if alpha is equal to 2, we get the squared poverty gap index or the P2 measure. Poverty cannot be adequately measured with income alone, as Amartya Sen's capability framework, examined in Chapter 1, makes apparent. To fill this gap, Sabrina Alcura and James Foster have extended the FGT index to multiple dimensions. In the multidimensional poverty approach, a poor person is identified through what is called the dual cutoff method. First, the cutoff levels within each of the dimensions, analogous to falling below a poverty line such as $1.25 per day if income poverty were being addressed. Second is the cutoff of the number of dimensions which a person must be deprived to be deemed multidimensionally poor. Next, we will be discussing the poverty, inequality, and social welfare. So what's so harmful about extreme inequality? First, the extreme income inequality leads to economic inefficiency. This is partly because at any given average income, the higher the inequality is, the smaller the fraction of the population that qualifies for a loan or other credit. The second reason to be concerned with inequality above the poverty line is that extreme income disparities undermine social stability and solidarity. High inequality strengthens political power of the rich and thus concentrates economic and social bargaining power. Finally, extreme inequality is generally viewed as unfair. Social welfare function, we will write welfare W in this formula, where Y is the income per capita that enters our welfare function positively. I, inequality, enters negatively, and P, absolute poverty, also enters negatively. These three components have distinct significance and we need to consider all three elements to achieve an overall assessment of welfare in developing countries. As introduced by Garfield, Lawrence curves may be used to analyze three limiting cases of dualistic development. The first case is the modern sector enlargement. The modern sector enlargement growth typology, in which the two-sector economy develops by enlarging the size of its modern sector while maintaining constant wages in both sectors. Next is the modern sector enrichment, in which the economy grows but such growth is limited to a fixed number of people in the modern sector. with both the numbers of workers and their wages held constant in the traditional sector. Last is the traditional sector enrichment. The traditional sector enrichment growth typology, in which all of the benefits of growth are divided among traditional sector workers, with little or no growth occurring in the modern sector. Using these three special cases and Lorentz curves, Fields demonstrated the validity of the following proposition. In traditional sector enrichment, the growth results in higher income, a more equal relative distribution of income, and less poverty. Traditional sector enrichment growth causes the Lorentz curve to shift uniformly upward and closer toward the line of equality, while in modern sector enrichment, growth results in higher incomes, a less equal relative distribution of income, and no change in poverty. Modern sector enrichment growth causes the Lorentz curve to shift downward and further from the line of equality. Last is the modern sector enlargement. The absolute incomes rise and absolute poverty is reduced, but the Lorentz curves will always cross, indicating that we cannot make any unambiguous statement about changes in relative inequality. It may improve or worsen. Simon Kuznets suggested that in the early stages of economic growth, the distribution of income will tend to worsen. Only at later stages will it improve. This observation came to be characterized by the inverted U-Kuznets curve. Kuznets' inverted U hypothesis is a graph reflecting the relationship between a country's income per capita and its inequality of income distribution. Because a longitudinal time series plot of changes in the distribution of income, as measured, for example, where the Gini coefficient seemed when per capita GNI expanded to trace out an inverted U-shaped curve. In some of the cases, Kuznets studies illustrated in the figure 5.10.
Inequality and development. The Kuznets curve. Inequality tends to increase as economies experience economic development. According to the Kuznets curve, after American economist Simon Kuznets, inequality in an economy will increase as it raises its level of development, say from point A to point B in the graph. At very low levels of development, the majority of the population have little income, and inequality is relatively low. As an economy develops, a few can gain high rewards, widening the income gap. However, with further development, a middle class emerges and inequality falls from its peak at C to D. Higher income means higher taxes and a larger public sector where more is spent on public and merit goods and on social welfare.
Growth and inequality. It is not just the rate but also the character of economic growth, how it is achieved, who participates, which sectors are given priority, what institutional arrangements are designed and emphasized, that determines the degree to which that growth is or is not reflected in improved living standards for the poor. Clearly, it is not necessary for inequality to increase for higher growth to be sustained.
Good day, everyone. My name is Alorji Dasa, and I will be your second reporter for today. Now, let us talk about the fourth subtopic, which is absolute poverty, its extent and magnitude. Absolute poverty has been discussed by prior groups, but to refresh, in the idea of absolute poverty, it is just the lack of um, basic necessities like house, foods, and clothing. Now let's talk about the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI. Excuse me. The MPI is published by Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OPHI, and UNDP's Human Development Report Office. Okay, now let's talk about the index tracks deprivation across the following 3 dimensions and 10 indicators. The 3 dimensions that I'm talking right now are health, education, and living standards. Whereas in these 3 dimensions or categories, the indicators are grouped. In health, we have 2 indicators. We have the nutrition and child mortality. Nutrition is the meaning itself, while child mortality can be, excuse me, measured through the years of the living mortality of children. And in education, we have 2, the year of schooling and school attendance, whereas this is where we measure if students or children are participating in class or attending class. And also we have 6 indicators in the last dimension, which is living standard. We have excuse me again, cooking fuel, sanitation, water, electricity, floor, and assets. Okay, after knowing that, let's tackle about the connections between MPI and SDGs. SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, have been discussed by prior groups. We have here the 3 dimensions as well as the SDGs connected to them. In health dimension, it covers 2 SDG, the SDG number 2 and SDG number 3. SDG number 2 stands for Zero Hunger, and SDG number 3 is Health and Well-being, because health dimension tackles about nutrition and mortality. In education, we have the SDG number 4, which is quality education. In living standards dimension, it covers 4 SDGs, namely SDG number 1, no poverty, SDG number 6, clean water and sanitation, SDG number 7, affordable and clean energy, and SDG number 11, which is sustainable cities and communities. Okay, the MPI ranges from 0 to 1, and higher values means higher poverty. If the person is deprived among 1/3 or more of the indicators, the global MPI identifies them as MPI poor. The extent or intensity of their poverty is also measured through the percentage of deprivation they are experiencing. Now let's discuss about current facts about MPI. The 2022 Global MPI uses the most current, comparable data available for 111 countries. As mentioned in the video I played earlier, not all countries are or have data to be used for MPI. As per the true result, 1.2 billion people, or 19.1%, lived in multidimensionally poor family. Half of the poor people, or 593 million, are children under the age of 18. About 8.1 of poor people, nearly 94 million, are age 60 or older. The developing region, where the largest of numbers of poor people lived in sub-Saharan Africa, nearly 579 million people. Computing MPI. To compute MPI, we will use the following formula. HA equals H times A. HA is the adjusted headcount ratio, H is the headcount ratio, A is the average intensity of the probation. Though I will not tackle more about this formula. So we can discuss more about the more important matters. Okay, the dimensional monotonicity. If a person already identified as poor becomes deprived in another indicator, she or he is measured as even poorer. Meaning, with this dimensional monotonicity, for further discussions about MPI, please refer to the next video.
Alright, hello, welcome back to A-Level Lessons Online. Okay, we're moving on to the next part of Human Geography Team 2.1. I'm going to looking at your next development indicator. Okay, this is going to be your multi-dimensional poverty index. Okay, in short, MPI. Alright, so your MPI is very similar. Okay, somewhat similar to your HDI. It does look at several similar factors as well. Okay, so we're going to dive into exactly what are the different dimensions that MPI will look at and what exactly it means. Alright. So the definition of MPI is very, very simple. It basically means, or at least, identifies what are the different deprivations of people in terms of health, in terms of education, and in terms of standard of living. Okay, so it looks at different factors, such as nutrition, child mortality, years of schooling, living standards, and more. Okay, we'll look at exactly what the index, what proportion of what are the different factors supposed to be of this index later on. Okay, but essentially this is what it revolves around. So it reflects the incidence of multi-dimensional poverty and its intensity in a country. Okay, what do I mean by this? It basically states, what or at least to what extent, based on this poverty level, would determine how intense your poverty is within that country itself. Okay, so that's basically what it measures. It measures the incidence, when there is a high level of poverty, and if so, how intense, is the poverty in that country supposed to be like. Okay, so it looks at the percentage of people who live in multidimensional poverty. Okay, so usually MPI tends to look towards the percentage, instead of having something solid, a solid number. And you look at, usually when you look at MPI, you look at the in terms of comparing within countries. What is the different MPI levels within different countries, as well as what is the difference in how poverty levels are like when you compare it amongst different countries. Alright, so if we move on after this, this is basically what your multi-dimensional poverty index scale looks like. So essentially what it does, is it combines different factors, and each factor of health, education, as well as living standards, each take up 1/3 each. So it's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. You add up, you get these dimensions of poverty. So within health itself, it splits itself into nutrition as well as child mortality. On the other hand, for education, you're looking at the years of schooling as well as what is the school attendance. And then for living standards, you're looking at, do they have cooking fuel? Are they able to sanitize themselves? Do they have proper access to sanitation? What is the presence of drinking water there? Do they have clean water to drink? Do they have electricity to go about doing their daily necessities? Do they have good housing? And what are the assets they have in terms of monetary assets or any other form of assets that they hold? So this is what MPI looks like. It combines the different aspects of health, education, living standards to form this MPI. Alright, so what are some of the benefits of MPI? So remember, similar to HDI, we're looking at your evaluation for these two indicators. Everything always boils down to your evaluation. So benefits, firstly, it captures distinct and broader aspects of poverty. So MPI is targeted towards poverty only. So you're not looking at wide-scale development across the country. You're looking specifically at poverty, which is why it's multidimensional poverty index. So when you look at MPI, okay, you're looking at a lot of aspects of poverty, things like their standard of living, their health, their education. All this will determine whether people are actually still going to be stuck in poverty or whether they're going to be able to get out of it, or what are the levels, okay, of their living standards, which determines the fact that they are in poverty. So it also captures the cause of deprivation directly. So the causes, okay, does also indicate, right? So things like health, which is lacking, or either that living standards, certain living standards which are lacking. Okay, these are what will be the what MPI captures. Okay, it captures all these causes. So your health and education outcomes. Okay, it also reviews great variations in poverty levels within countries. So within countries itself, okay, there could be varying levels of poverty. Okay, so for instance, a certain city or a certain area of a country within Africa, for example, Nairobi, okay, could have a higher MPI as compared to another country. I mean, or another city within Africa itself. So when you're looking at within countries, okay, you can actually tell what the different levels of poverty are. Okay, and you can from there assess, okay, which areas are lacking in terms of their health, education, and any sort of living standards. Okay, so this is good for comparison as well. Okay, MPI is a good way to compare. Okay, so then what are some limitations that it has? Okay, so some limitations that MPI has would be that there are still many facets of poverty that the index actually does not cover. Okay, for instance, you have got conflicts, personal security, domestic violence. Okay, these are certain things which may still occur within your areas of poverty, okay, especially things like domestic violence, but where we don't actually measure it. Okay, we measure a lot of very tangible things like health, your education, your standard of living. Okay, those are the things that we were actually looking at instead over here. So we don't exactly touch base on everything. Okay, not only that, okay, some locations also do not have recorded MPI. So certain areas which are more closed off, okay, they can't exactly measure, or that they simply just do not access those areas to measure MPI. Okay, as a result, these areas do not have MPI values, which means that it may not exactly be entirely comparable amongst every city-state or either every country, okay, because not everyone will have this MPI index. Okay, for instance, if you look at some more developed nations as well, okay, they may not also have recorded MPI. Reason being is because poverty is so low, so it's very hard to measure it to begin with.
Relationship between growth and poverty. There is an association between growth and poverty reduction because they are interrelated. When it is inclusive, growth reduces poverty. Lower extreme poverty may also lead to higher growth. Poor health, nutrition, and education lowers economic productivity of people in poverty, leading directly and indirectly to slower growth. Now we have the fifth subtopic, which is economic characteristics of high poverty groups. This will explain where high poverty groups are located. We have for number one, rural poverty, and number two, ethnic minorities and indigenous populations and poverty. In rural poverty, perhaps the most valid generalizations are that they are disproportionately located in rural areas, such as provinces and such. They are primarily engaged in agricultural and associated activities and more likely women and children than adult males. They are often concentrated among minority ethnic groups and indigenous people. Well, as I have said earlier, the rural poverty is where most poverty cases can be seen, according to the MPIs. Next, we have, as you can see, these are pictures associated with agricultural and rural areas. There was this table in which explains the number of poor in millions in urban and rural areas. The rows are the years 1993, 2002, 1993 again, and 2002 again, in which in the first two columns there are $1 a day, and the third and fourth column we have $2 a day. Both days are, or we can see that rural is higher than urban. For instance, the rural and the $1 a day is 1,036 million, while in urban it's just 236 million. There was a huge gap in between urban and rural areas. Another group where most poverty are concentrated is the ethnic minorities, indigenous people, indigenous populations, and poverty. It should be noted that the poor mostly came from poor countries. This is correct. Poor countries such as Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, etc., are poor countries. Although this may be like trivial observation, it is actually a useful note of optimism. The higher income achieved, poverty and per capita is increased. Factors of production. It means resources or inputs required to produce a good or a service such as land, labor, and capital. Now we have the sixth subtopic, which is policy measures on income inequality and poverty. Some basics considerations. Number one, we have areas of intervention, and number two, we have policy options. We will explain this further in the next slide. These are the areas of intervention: moderating or reducing the size distribution at upper levels, moderating or increasing the size distribution at lower levels, and altering the functional distribution. And lastly, mitigating the size distribution. These areas of intervention can be used to increase growth and reduce poverty. Lastly, we have policy options, such as changing relative factor prices, progressive redistribution of asset ownership, progressive taxation, which is we have now, and transfer payments and public provisions of goods and services.
Again, good day everyone, and thank you for watching.